Hey there, new video for Brewer's Tool Belt. We have new release 1.3 with a couple big new features, one of which is pH, salt, water adjustment section to the recipe tool. So you can now do complete all the math required to figure out how to get your pH right in your mash, sparge after the boil, and getting all the various different ions where you want them, calcium, sulfate, magnesium, and so on. Before I start, I want to give a big thank you to Kai Troster, the Braukaiser, for all the awesome work he did on his write-ups and research, and also Mark Riff, R-I-F-F-E, who wrote a couple papers called A Homebrewing Perspective on Mash pH that analyzed Kai Troster's work. So the combination of the two is the basis for this tool. So thank you to them. So you can see here I'm in the recipe tool in Brewer's Tool Belt, and I already have an American IPA recipe here that I'll be working on. You can see here all the various different sections. There's a new one down here called water. So if I go in here, it takes input from other sections of the tool. Most notably, you can see here mash fermentables. So that actually just pulls it in from whatever fermentables you've already put in. You can see here on the opening page, I can see the distilled water pH. So if I were to just mash in with distilled water rather than my local water or RO water, or a mix of the two, this is what my pH would come in. I haven't input any of the data yet, so the mash pH isn't showing, and the various different ions. But here you'll get the ions in the mash, in the sparge. This final section is actually after the boil, so it takes into account boil off and recalculates. So this would be what actually goes into your fermenter, what your ion levels are. And then if you put in a target, it'll show it here so you can reference it. So this top part's kind of a overview, and then you have all your various different settings here at the bottom. So I'll just go through those. Mash fermentables. Again, this just pulls from whatever fermentables you put into the recipe. These aren't modifiable. This is just so you can see what you put in, and it's giving you the pH specific data around that. So I can see here the different fermentables that went in. It only takes into account fermentables that are either base or adjuncts. So I'll show you that here in a second. But I can see here this 2-row, I can see the acidity contribution, I can see the percentage acidity contribution overall, and that's based on the percentage of the grain bill that's this fermentable versus the others. And then most importantly, I can see how it's marked. So a lot of the work that Kai Troster did was around fitting curves to different types of grain. So he found that base, crystal malt, roast malt, wheat, he came up with equations that fit fairly nicely against that data set. I will note that another thing that he found was that there's a lot of variance there, and a lot of the assumptions that brewers make around acidity contributions aren't necessarily accurate. So really this tools, and basically all the water tools, are going to give you a best guess at where your pH will end up, but it's not going to be completely accurate, because like for example, you could have two different brands or maltsters, 2-row, same Lovibond rating, and they'll contribute different levels of acidity. Or he also showed cases where there's actually lighter caramel malts that contribute more acidity than darker caramel malts, although most people assume that darker caramel malts contribute more acidity. So there's definitely exceptions to the rule, but overall this should get you in the right ballpark, and then you can tweak it from there. So this pH type has to be set correctly with the grain. I'll show you that. So for example, you can see here I have all these set as base. If I had a caramel malt here, actually Carapils really is a caramel malt, so I should switch that. So I'll go back over to the fermentables portion, and what you'll see now is I've added in the pH type. So you can see the type is it a grain or sugar, and again, only grains and adjuncts will be taken over into the water calculator portion. But I can also now set the pH setting here. So for this one, it would be crystal, and then I can also change that behavior to say, okay, actually, again, it'll only be grains and adjuncts, but maybe there's an adjunct that's not going to be in the mash, and so I don't want it as part of the calculation. I can mark it as such, and then it won't be taken into account. So now, if I go back over to water and I look at the fermentables, I'll see this guy's marked as crystal. So now the correct equation is going to be applied to this grain. So if you don't mark this correctly, the calculation can be dramatically off. So so this is just to quickly check to make sure everything is set right, and then I can go adjust if it's not. There's two different profiles here. There's water profile is your source water, so your tap water or your well water. You could also just put in, if you use off-the-shelf water, RO water, you can just put in the data you have from that. So you can put in multiple here, so it'll store all the different profiles you put in. So in this case, I just have one. You can just create it by adding a new, and then I hit this info button here to go in and put my numbers in. So whatever my water report has, I can put in my various different numbers, and then you need to click on it to set it. So I'll just go ahead and click on this new water profile. Actually, I'll set it over to my test one because I think I have numbers in here. So whichever one you set will then show up. Same thing for target profile. This would be, if I want my water to look like Burnt on Trent water or something like that, you can put those settings here and target pH. And then again, you just click it and then it'll be selected and you'll see it here. So next you have, what are you actually going to add in to the mash and sparge. So this is the most data fields, and up top it's going to show you at this point in time what is the estimated mash pH and what is the estimated ions. I haven't put in any numbers for the amount of water, so it can't do the calculation yet. I can see here this actually pulls from the mash portion of your recipe, so I can see here that I have it set for 10.5 gallons. So I do brew in a bag, so I would normally just go ahead and set this number to be the same, and you can now see the numbers up top will automatically come through. I don't use any RO, and then I use all that water. So what you can do here is, let's say you're a 3-vessel brewer, you could do you could put 10.5 gallons of water into your sparge tank. Then maybe you only use 6 of that, and that'll leave 4.5 gallons. You can then reuse that water, so you could just top that off with another 6 gallons or however you do that, and you'll see in the sparge it can take all that into account. So this example is brew in a bag, but it certainly works for batch sparge, fly sparge, however you want to do. If you do a mix of RO or and your tap water, then you can do that here and just say what percentage of that blend is RO or distilled. Yeah, all these numbers, you can update them on the fly here. Then also in the mash, what type of salts am I going to add in? So maybe I'll do 5, probably not ounces, 5 grams of gypsum, and maybe 5 grams of calcium chloride, let's say. And then down at the bottom here, you can put in the amount of acids or acidulated malt. I didn't just pull the acid malt from the fermentables list. There was too much room for error there where if people put in their own custom grain or things like that, it wouldn't pull it as acidulated malt. So I wanted to make sure to add a field in here so that could be make sure everyone is setting that the way they want. So let's say I want to do 2 milliliters of 88% lactic acid, but you can use any of these acids here. Okay, now you can see up top my estimated mash pH has come through, and then you can see in the mash itself what do my ions look like. And I used all 10s for my base water, so you can see wherever I wasn't affected by my mash salts here that it got updated appropriately. Okay, so that's mash additions. And as I mentioned, I do brew in a bag. I don't sparge. So I would normally just leave this all zeros and be done with it. But if you're batch sparge or fly sparge, something like that, where you are, or you're brewing a bag and you're using sparge water, you can use this section here. So again, if I refill my sparge, I would say, okay, what is my actual total volume at the once I refill it. Key one here is use water left over from mash. So this is if I have 10.5 gallons of sparge and I only use 5.5 gallons of it, that leaves 5 gallons. If I just add water back in, all the salts that were in there are still there, so I have to take that into account. So this is saying, did I just dump the water that I used for my initial sparge, or do I reuse it? I think most people probably reuse it, so that the default here is yes. Again, is it a percentage of RO distilled or not? And then how much is being used to sparge with? And that's what this runoff delta is. This number helps guide this used in sparge. The runoff delta is, I calculate what is the projected runoff from the initial mash runoff. So however much water went into the mash, and then subtract out the projected amount of loss due to grain absorption. I take that number and I subtract that from the desired boil volume. So how much do I want to have when I start my boil? So let's say you want to start with 10 gallons. I project from the mash that you would run off 6 gallons. The delta would be 4 gallons. So if you're batch sparge, then you would be adding 4 gallons for your second sparge, or for your second batch. And if you're fly sparge, then you would be fly sparging with a total of 4 gallons. You can see here this number is negative, right, which tells me that I actually am running off more than I want for my initial at the start of the boil. So let's take a look at that. So I can see here I actually have a pretty thick or pretty thin mash here. So if I make it a little thicker, I can see here I'm now running off less. So for me, I normally want to tune this to 0 so that at the beginning of my boil I have the right amount without having to add any additional water. I don't really worry too much about mash thickness as long as it doesn't get really thick or absurdly thin, but as long as I'm in like the 1.25 to 2.5, 3 range even, I don't worry about it too much. So in this case, let's say I do 1.5 and that I'm going to need an additional 1.4 gallons in order to get to my starting boil volume, and you can see that here again. I'm predicting that I'm going to run off 6.85 from the mash. I want to start with 8.25, so based on my evaporation rate that I will end up at the final volume that I want. So again, that delta is the difference between these two numbers. So if I go back to the sparge additions, I can see here I need 1.4 gallons is projected. And again, there'll be some variance there in reality because the grain absorption might be a little higher or lower with different maltsters grains, but it should be pretty close. So now I just basically want to I didn't just go ahead and do that automatically to give people the ability to tweak it if they want, but really these should match. Now I can go up to the top here and I can see this is I haven't added any salts in. Now maybe I'd go back and say, okay, in the mash my numbers look pretty good. My final numbers, maybe I want one of these numbers higher, so I might add some more salt into the sparge. So maybe I'll just add a little more gypsum here. Let's just add another 2 grams. And you can add in sparge acid if you want. I don't do pH calculations in the sparge or in the boil, just because my experience has been the calculations are pretty inaccurate. So I didn't want to mislead people and so they think that these numbers will be super accurate when they really aren't. But you can put the numbers in here just so that it'll go into your recipe so you can remember to add them in on brew day. But there is no sparge or boil pH predictions in the tool at this point. Okay, so now I have mash additions, sparge additions, and that's it. And then up top I can see my distilled water pH. I can now see my predicted mash pH is 5.5. My mash ions, the sparge water ions, and then when all that's combined and I boil off my projected amount, this is what my ions will be at the end of the boil. So this is what my ions into the actual fermenter would be. So I can see my calcium is, about where I'd want it, and I can see where my other final numbers are, and then I can just compare. These probably aren't your target numbers, but I can compare where I'm at the end with what my target is. And this is a little different than other tools. Usually their targets are trying to get the water itself to mimic. For me, the target is where do I want to be when I go into the fermenter. So, and this is just for you to do easy comparison. These target numbers aren't taken into account with anything. It's just so you can compare your numbers to your target numbers. I might say this number is my mash pH is a little high. Maybe I want it to be 5.4 or 5.3. So let's take a case of 5.4. I could just then go into mash additions. I can see them at 5.5, and I'll just start ticking up and just say, okay, I'll double my lactic acid here, and now I can see that I'm down at 5.44. Maybe I add just a little bit more and do 5 mils, and now I'm down at 5.41, and that's fine by me. So now I can go back and say, okay, I pretty much am where I want to be. I have my mashes right at about 5.4. My final ions are where I want, and now I want to go ahead and email the recipe to myself so I can print it, since I can't print from my my phone. Or maybe I want to share it with someone. We can go over here and you can just email it as HTML. When you do that, I've now added that into the email, so I can see with my water I've now injected the predicted mash pH. This is a different recipe, so the numbers are a little different. All the various different stages where the ions are, which profile and target that I have set. I can see how much water I'm planned on treating for the mash. If any of it was RO, I can see it only is going to show you non-zero or greater than 0 amounts here. So I'll see that I want to add in gypsum, calcium chloride, and this much lactic acid, and then the same thing for the sparge. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. As with everything, I always love feedback. There's a feedback link off of my website, www.hommelhomebrew.com, where you can go in and send me your feedback. Just go under the Brewer's Tool Belt section, and there's a link there at the bottom to provide feedback. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and have a good one.